context of Rami, I mean, his presentation reminding us of the effects of neoliberal politics and economics of development, right? The impact of top-down forces of urbanization in the shape of hyper privatization, many of the stuff, all the stuff that we know about, and how that begins to compromise the, of course, the very nature of the public, the kind of effect it had in really reminding the social spaces in the city, all what we know, but he spent a lot of time reminding us of all the effects and the kind of ills, you know, of neoliberalism, which all of us should be aware, because we cannot begin any project without unpacking the very mechanisms of those institutional conditions of power, visualization of the hegemony of those conditions. I think those become systems that we need to understand at a macro level in order to really return to the kind of micro level and begin to reorganize those very conditions across politics and economics of development and so on. But that's what he was talking about when he mentioned issues of management, issues of governance, you know. But at the end, he left that question in my mind. He said, then if that is a project, if we need to be the ones, hopefully as architects and urbanists, the ones that will design the reorganization of the systems, you know, what does it mean? And how, what is the consequence of that reorganization in new spatial paradigms? Because when he talked about this, the redistribution of resources, issues of displacement, illegality, I mean, you can argue that many of these neoliberal developments, and I've been researching many of these, are characterized by the same type of illegality that the informal sector usually is blamed for. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I had an opportunity to do a project in Rotterdam having to do with street markets that are constantly burdened with over-regulation to the point that many of these markets in migrant neighborhoods in some areas of Rotterdam are beginning to disappear. And I thought to myself, well, these guys, meaning the kind of neoliberal system, is not consistent. If they want to uphold the idea of a free market that is somehow enabling the kind of economic entrepreneurial energies of the community, why is it that they are just focusing on the large-scale economy? Why is it that they are just focusing on the kind of large corporate power, on deregulation, and ultimately illegality as we know it? Why is it then that they are not enabling these informal economies, which ultimately somebody like Hernando de Soto, who I appreciate but also I'm very critical of, suggests let's bring the informal economy as an ultimate sort of emblematic gesture of capitalism in terms of the entrepreneurial energy. So it produces a kind of issue of scale, large versus small, and what is it really what we are trying to enable as devices to sustain a community. So, but also the inconsistencies of these ideas in terms of free markets and the democratization of development and so on. So, but the point is that when he began to show his projects, after that huge exposition, the projects, even though interesting as urban interventions, I wanted to know more. They were presented in a typical way of architects showing, well, this is a space, public space where people gather, and and the possibility. I wanted to know how these spaces are managed. What is the type of governance behind those spaces? What are the mediating agencies that allow the interface, the curating of the interface? What are the points of access? See, this is something that has been in my mind a lot, is that we think as urbanists or architects that just because we beautify a space, people will magically appear and come together. And more I'm thinking that what we need to do is really curate somehow those spaces, not just from our own vantage point as architects, but in collaboration with agencies that can enable very different programs of use that really will produce the access. And therefore, bring very new conceptions of ambiguity, specificity, all these issues. I mean, I'm thinking I needed to know more about what makes these spaces perform. Because he had made a case in his presentation that in order to get to the point, we needed to really redefine issues of governance. So I'm being critical of Rami's presentation, but at the same time, I'm really embracing of course, his critique and reading of neoliberalism. The other thing that I wanted to mention is in the politician who came to speak, Mohammed. Yes?
Stay.
Again, you know, of course, a politician and so on, but I began to realize the kind of dysfunctionality, obviously, of institutions of governance that begin to ally themselves with the worst of methodologies to produce housing and development. And I kept thinking, even though at the end, well, I don't want to get into that, but the point is that hidden in his message were also very interesting conceptual tools, I would say. Remember when he said that housing, when he went to Europe and he was taken to France and Paris to see some projects that were seemingly interesting examples, and he said, these are new towns, but he said they don't work because they are bedroom communities. What about job production? This is something that a politician might say is never really followed by very smart procedures, but nevertheless it is a statement that is very powerful. What does that mean? It's exactly what I tried to share yesterday, is that bedroom communities is what perpetuates a recipe of development that sees density just as an amount of units of housing that are thrown in the territory indiscriminately. And as long as we don't connect housing with other devices, you know, not only infrastructure, in terms of public resources, many other things, but primarily thinking of housing as a device to sustain a community economically. Housing as an excuse to produce an economy, a double economy, a triple economy of local labor, the kind of transcending of the idea that housing is only shelter, but it can be a device to produce cultural interactions and many other things. So for a moment he was getting into something that I'm interested about, but again, the questioning of the housing paradigm. And then when I just go a few blocks away from here and I see the diplomats, whatever housing development and the other development, I say, my God, these are the worst examples of development that I can see. And why is it that this place that at least I idealize as a site of creativity cannot rethink its own logics of development in terms of rethinking housing as it relates to other things, primarily the ground. Something that really, really worries me here is that it's a very, I don't want to condemn sprawl or suburban. You know, I live in the capital of sprawl in California, Southern California. What I'm saying is that it's very sad to see these sort of blocks of housing and no reference, no relationship to the ground in the way that I think the project is a horizontal in its relationship to the vertical. But not only that, when I saw the diplomats' housing and that there's huge retaining walls, I see those retaining walls as a physicalization of stupidity, in the way, the inability to really relate to the topography differently, not only physically but programmatically, and so on. So that, see, that embedded in that statement by the politician, there is a lot of substance. The other one was when he said, then I realized in the new towns, I said, these new towns will not work. Why don't you bring me to neighborhoods, he said. And in that sense, I was reminded, again, I'm biased about this, that neighborhoods can be the devices to rethink urbanization. I recently, and I presented this, I did a project in Korea, and I tried to unpack these notions. What is a community? What do we mean by community? And what do we mean by neighborhoods? For a moment, one simplistic translation of that in my mind was that community constructs or is built by a set of values, set of kind of intangible relationships that constructs a kind of not only imaginary, but a sense of spirit, you know, a kind of, the neighborhood is a physicalization of those relationships. More and more, as is obvious, we are dealing here with a gradation of scales. How do we enable a new relationship between top-down and bottom-up, formal and informal dynamics, large and small, I think. And through that, the reimagining of what infrastructure could be. There are many texts about this. One of them by Stan Allen, an urban theorist from the United States, who I respect a lot, and he talked about the need of rethinking what infrastructure means. That infrastructure is not just building freeways, and of course infrastructure as a device of control and producing borders, as this is one of the places where that is put into effect physically, also a place where I live. But he said infrastructure is not just the solving of a problem unidimensionally, a big project of top-down, a freeway just to transport cars and nothing else. Infrastructure is a differential system, he said. In other words, infrastructures mediate between scales. Stan Allen, and the piece is called Infrastructural Urbanism. Anyway, what he was just saying, which is a beautiful notion, is that the true meaning of infrastructure is to mediate the large and the small, the formal and the informal. It's a device that manages time. It's about the temporalization of space. It's really about social difference. It's really a beautiful text. But that's what I kept thinking when he meant we need to rethink infrastructure. So this is a politician talking about these issues. I wanted to go deep into them, and then hopefully, as he said, the project that we need to enable is not about so much, I forget this process, but the process of building institutions, which I thought was fundamental. But then what do we do after that? This is what I would like to workshop, if we were to be here. How do we attack that problem? The kind of rethinking of institutions, the construction of new ways of thinking at institutional levels, and the new protocols that would enable a kind of way out. It's a huge problem of design, and that's the reason I keep arguing we need to expand our roles, because we cannot expect a politician to do it. We, from our own fields, which hopefully, we can propose out of reconceptualizing these relationships, interesting ways, interesting arrangements, different arrangements. Then, of course, Alessandro, again, this is good for the people who didn't come, this is my summary. Alessandro, in a kind of very poetic and sort of this notion of the thickness. I didn't write too much about that, but the kind of thickness of the line. I mean, again, just even the presentation, positioning the whole presentation as a story, as a kind of fable. I mean, I like these devices of how different people present material. But at the end of the day, very beautiful, very powerful, and very political, of course, a diagram of the thickness of the line and its spatial consequences. I think all of us engaged in these issues of conflict realize that we cannot advance our thinking without entering into these other realms that have remained very peripheral to design. And one of them is law, is a kind of visualization of policy, is really the radicalization of cartography. In this case, how do we as designers construct the evidential processes, right, that can enable the recognition of the crisis in more tangible terms, and more than anything, enable a new political language, right, in terms of the kind of almost pedagogical tools, the mediating artifacts that can enable a different political language, not only from our own specializations, but in terms of the voice of the community. This is an important, before you came, I was talking about the huge gap that exists in our time, and primarily in the United States. I think it's not only there anymore, but Europe is also, this gap between institutions and publics. Between not only institutions of governance, but cultural institutions in the public. So I was mentioning earlier the need to re-engage urban pedagogy, new models of education at the scale of publics. Then, of course, Omar really summarized it at the end. I mean, in terms of the need to always think of space in terms of socio-political meanings, reminding us, of course, in a sense of the recognition that planning at the end of the day is an operational tool of power. And so in what ways do we counter? In other words, how do we think of counter strategies that equal. I mean, this is obvious, and we've been talking a lot about this, but in terms of how do we then produce that? I love what he said about the need to redesign forms of urban resistance. And how, again, that's the proposition. Let's get to work. How do we then produce those methodologies? And I think also Omar was mentioning how do we then engage. I think there was a focus, as I remember, in terms of liminal zones, transitional spaces. What are the devices to rethink? And I'm saying that because that's what I wanted to present first, this case study that I did that might seem a little bit silly, but I will show it anyway in the context of Ramallah. But in terms of the power of liminal zones, in the power of the kind of more radical idea of urbanization as led by the reorganization of socioeconomic relations. Not so much buildings yet, but how do we prepare the ground for a very different idea of architecture and so on. We finished yesterday by some artists, and it was beautiful to finish with the work of artists and the narrativization of conflict, the notion of the archive. I wanted to ask a question, but I think because there was Diane Taylor who wrote this beautiful book called The Archive and the Repertoire. And she was just questioning the nature of archives at a time when a lot of artists wanted to engage the issues of information, reconstruction of information, hidden histories, archives. But how do archives can be deployed as new tools of knowledge? That much of our task as artists, I think, is the visualization of hidden sociopolitical histories, of exclusion and disparity and so on. But that is not enough to bring up that information. The question is, what do we do with that information? And so in this book, Diane Taylor begins to suggest how archives become operational tools. And then, of course, Schumann's presentation at the end, a very beautiful, kind of poetic, very lyrical way of dealing with the topic, and very idiosyncratic way of presenting, was very, very beautiful and fun. But again, it speaks of the task of the artist as translator. And I think that that's an important issue here. But in my case, I've been interested in the issue of translation, and how we as architects not only translate in poetic terms, but primarily become the interlocutors between communities and specialized kind of sources of knowledge. In other words, my interest at the border in Tijuana, San Diego has been to translate the hidden potential of informal economies and densities into new forms of governance, into new forms of economy at the scale of the top-down. And so I think that more and more artists become not only translators in the sense of the poetic, but in a more functional, at times, operative dimension. The usefulness of this in order to contaminate this other system into new procedures. And I think that issue of translation is an important one as well. But back to Omar, he finished by saying, questioning the role of architects. And that's what I wanted to focus today's workshop, if I can